What is gender-critical fascism, how does it relate to the fascism of Nazi Germany, and why do its adherents spend so much time and energy claiming to be feminist? These are just a few of the questions we will be answering throughout today's video. But first, a quick content warning for the following. Transphobia, racism, ableism, anti-Semitism, the Holocaust, misogyny, misgendering, medical violence, and sexual violence. If our work has helped you, please consider supporting us via Patreon so that we can keep the channel running. We cannot survive without your support. You can also help us by liking, commenting, and sharing our work on social media. I'd also just like to take this time to remind our viewers that the statements made throughout our videos are the opinions of myself, the host, based on the evidence I have available to me. They are not and should not be taken as unquestionable fact, which is why we reference everything, because we're fallible. Thus we try to give you, the viewer, the ability to check all evidence yourself in order to make up your own mind, which is what the reference numbers in the top left corner are for, being numbers that match up with the reference list found in the transcript linked down below. As such, we encourage all viewers to do their own research to reach an informed conclusion about the topic. Hi there, my name is Ethel Thurston, she, her, they, them, and it's time to define what gender-critical fascism is, what is typically mislabeled as gender-critical feminism or trans-exclusionary radical feminism by its adherents and their accomplices in the mainstream press. And the way to do that is by going over its two fundamental tenets and comparing them to our understanding of fascism. Those tenets are 1. Trans women are cis men lying about being women to gain access to and assault real women, and 2. Trans men are vulnerable girls who have, as part of some insidious conspiracy, been misled into believing that they're men as a means to pressure them to undergo chemical and surgical sterilization. The words might change, but these are the two core beliefs that unify all gender-critical fascists. And to really understand just how pervasive these narratives are, all we have to do is take a step back to realize that these beliefs line up perfectly with the two primary theaters of the current culture war targeting trans people, those being access to gender spaces and access to gender-affirming care. Though, before we can look at them in detail and compare them to our understanding of fascism, we need to define what fascism is. Two traits commonly cited as defining features of fascism are authoritarianism and ultranationalism. And whilst it's true that they are important, they are not, in fact, the defining features of fascism. That would be palingenesis, the idea of national rebirth. Fascists believe that a thriving society becomes the target of undesirable people, often labelled degenerates, who seek to infect society with a form of social decay, their degeneracy, resulting in the weakening and subsequent collapse of said society. Fascists argue that the only way to break said degeneracy and thus save society is to instigate their personal brand of violent ultranationalism, destroying the degenerates, bringing about a new golden age. This is why Mussolini viewed his flavour of Italian fascism to be the successor to the Roman Empire, whilst Hitler viewed the Nazis to be the successor to the German Empire, who were, in turn, the successor to the Holy Roman Empire. That's why the Nazis were the Third Reich, the Third Empire having its golden age. This is also why we never use the term degeneracy, especially in the context of people. To do so is to breathe life into fascist mythology, lending it power that its members will exploit to further their control in society. The only people who would seek to do such a thing are Nazis themselves. Returning to Nazi Germany, Adolf Hitler gained popularity with many of the German people by promising that he'd bring an end to the supposed state of degeneracy, which he argued had broken the German people in 1917, losing them the First World War and bringing about the weak Weimar Republic. And who did Hitler claim was the main source of this supposed degeneracy? Why, Jewish people, of course. Hitler not only believed that it was Jewish people who were responsible for the loss of the First World War, but that they had, through their apparent control of the German media, promoted what he described in Mein Kampf as the big lie. What was the big lie? Why, the very thought that Germany lost the First World War due to the incompetence of its own military, including generals such as Heinrich Ludendorff, a staunch nationalist whom Hitler admired. Hitler asserted that said lie was so far gone by design, believing that, since most people would be ashamed to say something so dishonest, such a lie overrode people's logical faculties, leading them to accept said apparent lie on emotions alone. Hitler claimed that the big lie was used by the Jewish people to further break the German spirit and neutralize any resistance, such as Ludendorff, declaring it to have, quote, taken away the weapon of moral right from the only adversary dangerous enough to be likely to succeed in bringing the betrayers of the fatherland to justice. End quote. Yet this was not the only source of degeneracy that the Nazis saw. One particular man who caught the Nazis' attention was a Jewish sexologist by the name of Magnus Hirschfeld. Magnus was a strong advocate for those science had largely deemed taboo, including both trans and gay people, founding the Scientific Humanitarian Committee as well as the World League for Sexual Reform to help undo said stigma. He also founded the Berlin Institute for Sex Research, an institution that offered both comprehensive sex education and early forms of HRT, paid for on a sliding scale. Magnus personally coined the term transvestite, which would later evolve into transsexual and subsequently transgender. Yet, far from being impressed, the Nazis saw Magnus's work as part of a deliberate attempt by a Jewish man to further weaken the German people, infecting them with sexual degeneracy, leading to a breakdown of traditional family roles and by extension the family unit, making the country more vulnerable to outside invaders. That is why Nazi papers such as Der Stürmer ran front-page articles like this one containing a sketch of Magnus calling him a, quote, greedy Jew, peasant's friend, end quote, before going on to declare that, quote, the Jews are our misfortune, end quote. That is why, on the 6th of May 1933, the Nazis raided the institute, confiscating its literature and patient documents. Said materials would provide the bulk of what was destroyed in early book burnings in Berlin. Yet the Nazis kept hold of the institute's register, using it to round up its staff and clients, both trans and gay, most of whom were forced into concentration camps under the Pink Triangle. Magnus was thankfully able to escape, but died in exile, never returning home. The tragedy does not end there, however. Unlike many of the other groups forced into concentration camps, the Pink Triangles were not set free as the Nazis fell. The Allies had no intention of undoing the laws the Nazis had put in place, criminalizing their very existence, and many of them were imprisoned the very moment the camps were opened. I bring this up to highlight the often ignored fact that the active part of the Holocaust for LGBT+ folk did not end with the fall of Nazi Germany. We also need to be aware of how fascists appropriate the language of other political movements in order to hide their intentions. For example, the Nazis of Nazi Germany famously labeled themselves nationalist socialist in order to split the leftist vote, leaning heavily into the idea that they'd protect German workers. The reality, meanwhile, is that they never had any intention of doing so and were just using the label to garner support from the opposition. Not only did they dissolve the unions the moment they seized power, but as Martin Niemöller famously opened one version of his harrowing poem, quote, first, they came for the socialists, end quote. Point is, you cannot trust a fascist to tell you that they're a fascist, and must instead look at their beliefs and actions through a critical lens. Starting with the first tenet, the narrative that trans women are cis men lying about being women to gain access to and assault real women. This is perhaps the oldest narrative forwarded by gender-critical fascism and can be found as far back as 1979, as seen in Janice Raymond's The Transsexual Empire, The Making of the She-Male. Raymond believed that all trans women engaged in rape along multiple fronts, asserting that they, quote, rape women's bodies by reducing the real female form to an artifact, appropriating this body for themselves. However, the transsexually constructed lesbian feminist violates women's sexuality and spirit as well. Rape, although it is usually done by force, can also be accomplished by deception. It is significant that in the case of the transsexually constructed lesbian feminist, often he is able to gain entrance and a dominant position in women's spaces because the women involved do not know he is a transsexual and he just does not happen to mention it. Because transsexuals have lost their physical members does not mean that they have lost their ability to penetrate women, women's mind, women's space, women's sexuality. Transsexuals merely cut off the most obvious means of invading women so that they seem non-invasive. End quote. Clearly promoting what we now recognize as the rape by deception narrative. A narrative that never really took off over the next 3 decades, with the primary focus being on lesbian, gay, and bisexual people and their attempts for equal consent laws and marriage equality. That was until we hit the trans tipping point of 2014, brought about by a combination of the internet and public figures such as Laverne Cox, an open black trans woman who was, at the time, starring in the smash hit series Orange is the New Black. Trans people became the new hot topic, leading to increased reporting, which brought with it increased scrutiny that quickly turned its ire towards trans-inclusive policies, leading to attack ads like this one in the US, which ran in 2015.
Houston's Proposition 1 bathroom ordinance. What does it mean to you? Any man at any time could enter a woman's bathroom simply by claiming to be a woman that day. No one is exempt. Even registered sex offenders could follow women or young girls into the bathroom, and if a business tried to stop them, they'd be fined. Protect women's privacy. Prevent danger. Vote no on the Proposition 1 bathroom ordinance. It goes too far.
Ads like these would come to define the narrative surrounding trans women within the US for the next few years, as seen in this almost identical attack ad run in 2018.
What does Massachusetts Question 3 mean to you? It means any man who says he is a woman can enter a woman's locker room, dressing room, or bathroom at any time, even convicted sex offenders. And if you see something suspicious and say something to authorities, you could be the one arrested and fined up to $50,000. Vote no on 3. This bathroom bill puts our privacy and safety at risk. It goes too far.
The focus in the UK, meanwhile, was on the then pending Gender Recognition Act reform that would have allowed a trans person to obtain a Gender Recognition Certificate, or GRC, via a legal declaration, sometimes known as self-ID. This was proposed as a replacement to the current system that forces trans people in the UK to go for a medicalized process. And I put medicalized in quotes here, since in spite of the process requiring 2 medical professionals to sign off on said transition, any failure to adhere to outdated and thoroughly misogynistic stereotypes of men and women can and is taken as evidence that a person isn't trans, leading to their denial. I had a friend who was forced to wear dresses to her consultations after a doctor told her that only men wear trousers, women wear dresses, therefore, I think you're having doubts. I hope it goes without saying just how dehumanizing said process is. Said proposed change was attacked by members of the gender critical movement, such as Jill Bairup, who framed the issue in the following terms in 2018, quote, "Gender self-identity. If you say you're a woman/man, then you are a woman/man and can have the gender recognition certificate to prove it. No diagnosis of gender dysphoria or action on your part is required. You're a man/woman now, and you and your vulva are entitled to access male-only spaces, and you and your penis and beard, if you feel that way inclined, are entitled to access female-only spaces. You know, changing rooms, prisons, sports, toilets, that sort of thing." End quote. Before going on to explicitly tether those concerns to safety in sarcastically adding that quote, "They deserved it, those nasty lesbians and feminists and transsexual women with their ridiculous concerns about women's safety. Who cares?" End quote. The transsexual women here refers to the singular token trans woman, Miranda Yardley, who is more than happy to sell out her fellow trans people for preferential treatment. This is not unusual for fascism. Just look up Ernst Röhm, the gay leader of the Nazi stormtroopers, who was assassinated the moment Hitler consolidated his power. Except there's just one big problem with this overall narrative, and that's the fact that self-ID was already the standard for public spaces within the UK, such as changing rooms and toilets. For you see, anyone in the UK can change the gender marker on their personal ID without a GRC. All it requires is a legal declaration, the very same as the reform suggested for obtaining a GRC. The only thing a GRC actually allows for is one to change their birth certificate, which is in turn needed to change their tax forms, marriage certificate, and pension forms. Private documentation. That's all the reform actually impacted. Anything used day to day, like your passport or driver's license, already operated under self-ID. Add this to the fact that a trans person's access to gender spaces was already legally enshrined as part of the 2010 Equality Act, regardless of whether or not they'd medically transitioned, and we can begin to see just how dishonest this entire narrative really is. This was already the case with respect to changing rooms and toilets since at least 2010, yet we hadn't seen a surge in violence within these spaces. In fact, we now have peer-reviewed science published in 2019 that demonstrates that trans-inclusive bathrooms are no more dangerous than bathrooms that exclude trans people. Because no shit, a rapist doesn't give two crats about what's legal and what isn't, they're a rapist. Bathrooms are not dwarven doors protected by magic runes. A shitty bit of plastic saying men or women won't do anything to stop a predator. Yet this narrative stuck around, as seen in this 2023 post by gender-critical leader J.K. Rowling, which reads, quote, "Nobody but useful idiots can be genuinely surprised that real fascists have spotted a glorious opportunity in trans activism. The homophobic anti-feminist far right has long held that the left is degenerate, foolish, immoral, and authoritarian. And now they can point to the incoherent arguments of the gender ideologues, the bullying tactics of the no-platformers, and the swarms of masked men threatening violence against women for wanting to retain single-sex spaces, and crow, 'We told you so,' end quote. Except, we know that the claims to be concerned about gendered or single-sex spaces are nothing more than a lie invented in order to demonize trans women, with the facts I just laid out having been made explicitly clear to Rowling over the years. So, when Rowling throws out the claim that trans people defending themselves from such slander is proof of what the real fascists have claimed, going so far as to explicitly label said community defense as degenerate, that is Rowling unintentionally revealing her own thoughts on the matter. And she is not alone. Kelly J. Key Minshall, also known as Posey Parker, is another leader of the gender-critical movement, just like J.K. Rowling. If you've ever seen the I Heart J.K. Rowling or Woman adult human female slogans, often put on billboards, merchandise, or hell, simply repeated as part of an anti-trans mantra, that is Key Minshall's brand. She is also the person who called on cis men to enter women's bathrooms armed in order to threaten anyone who didn't look traditionally feminine.
Had a bit of an idea about some of the things that you can do, and men, for once, I'm talking to you. I'm talking about you dads who maybe carry, I think that's what you say. I'm so down with the American lingo. Maybe you carry, maybe you don't. Maybe you consider yourself a protector of women. Maybe you're that sort of man. Maybe you have a daughter or a mother or a wife. Maybe you have a sister. Maybe you just have some friends. Maybe you just think women are human and you don't need any absolute connection with them to feel compelled to protect us. Um, I think you should start using women's toilets, men, because you have every right to self identify. Clearly, don't do it and upset women and girls that are already in there, but just make a point of doing it and maybe make the women feel okay about you doing it if if you come out and you frighten someone. But it's about time that you started using women's toilets and saying that you identify as a woman if stopped. And I think that's how you're going to that's one of the many ways that you are going to have to combat the insanity of self ID. Even if it's not called self ID, that's pretty much what you have now in the United States. And that's how you men are going to help. And there's going to be no excuses. And you either care about the women and girls in your life or you don't. But you are going to start inserting yourselves into spaces that are specifically for women and girls. Maybe you're going to do it when you go to your kids' school and they've had to inject this federal nonsense of accepting boys into girls' spaces. Maybe you need to make a point of saying to the head teacher that you're going to go and use the toilet and ask where the girls' toilets are. And you're going to make this really embarrassing for everybody who's going along with it. I'm talking about you dads who maybe carry, I think that's what you say. I'm so down with the American lingo. Maybe you carry, maybe you don't.
Not only is Key Minchell calling for gun violence against trans women, but she does so under the pretense of protecting cis women. This ignores how all attempts to exclude trans women from women's bathrooms has led to violence against cis women for not performing their gender in a way that lines up with traditionalist norms, like those forwarded under fascism. Cis women, particularly butch lesbians, women with short hair, and women of colour, have been targeted and even assaulted because their attackers assumed they were men, that is to say, trans women, on appearance alone. Just like Key Minchell is calling for here. This was a well-documented phenomenon as far back as 2016. Hell, even gender-critical members themselves have been made the target of such bigotry, with one suffering alopecia being attacked for competing in sports in 2023, and then inside an airport bathroom in 2024, receiving an outpouring of support from the trans community, only to come out and parrot the vague drivel that led her to be targeted in the first place. That's the environment Key Minchell wants to introduce firearms to. But that's part of the point. Yes, the gender-critical movement wants to exclude trans people from public life, but they also want to hurt any cis woman who doesn't adhere to the purely patriarchal norms of femininity fascism subscribes to. This violent ultranationalism is being invoked as a way to destroy perceived degeneracy, forcing things to return to the good old days in which women were forced to look stereotypically feminine and men were forced to look stereotypically masculine. And the signs continue, as heard in this now infamous talk given at an event organised by Key Minchell herself.
So we need to protect our language forever. Thank you. Well done, that woman. Hello. Language is the thing, and I went to Speaker's Corner almost 2 years ago and was far too scared to speak. And I tell you, I'm not scared now. I'm really ready to talk. Now, I'm going to talk to you about something that I haven't seen in the press. I'm a hypnosis practitioner, and I've been doing hypnosis for 30 years and helping people to hypnotize others. And I know about language. And I know that this is based on something we call the big lie. Do you know the big lie? The big lie was first described by Adolf Hitler in Mein Kampf. The big lie is such a big lie that ordinary people like us think, well, that can't be a lie, because I'd never tell any as big a lie as that. We only lie in small ways. The big lie, well, there is one big lie going on, and it was begun by men in the early part of the 20th century. It was began when they had an erotic fantasy, and they decided they were going to sell us the big lie. And what is the big lie? The big lie is trans women are, but they're not, are they? They're men, and we know that. Emotions are what caught them. They got caught not by rational things, they got caught by emotions. And how we're going to break this is by using emotions that shake them out so they can't find that emotion of sympathy ever again. Thank you. Hi. Okay, who's next?
Let's be clear, the speaker is not accusing trans people of engaging in Nazi-style propaganda. The big lie, as discussed by Hitler in Mein Kampf, the source the speaker references, was something he accused Jewish people of doing to break the spirit of the German people. So when the speaker accuses the trans community of promoting the big lie by acknowledging the facts that trans women are women, she's engaging in blatant Nazi rhetoric. And she knows this, hence she explicitly mentions the source. Yet, in spite of that, not a single person in the audience, including Kim Minchell, the organizer of the event, challenges her. They instead cheer her on, even as she declares Hitler as her inspiration for all to hear. Yet she is not alone in promoting this narrative. Lily Cade became a gender-critical icon after she invented the myth that the concept of the cotton ceiling, which had been created to discuss the ways in which society sexually devalues the bodies of all marginalized people, was a conspiracy by trans women to rape cis lesbians. Which is rather ironic, considering that Lily Cade is a self-confessed serial rapist of cis lesbians. Yet of interest to us is how, in her 2021 Gender Critical Manifesto, Cade declared that, quote, "This was done to hurt you, to make a mockery of you, to hold you down. This was done by men who hate women more than any other men who have ever walked the earth. The worst men that have ever existed, trans women. Men so worthless they can't even admit the most obvious thing about themselves that is obvious to the dogs and rats who can smell their manhood and should be obvious to every mother on earth. Trans women know they are men. They are forcing you to pretend to believe that they are women to rape your minds and the minds of your children. They are like Big Brother before them, twisting your language so that you don't have the words to make sense of reality. This is power, bitch. This is the shape of power. These men run your world now because you refuse to speak truth to power. Trans women are men. Say it, own it, know it. Hold the fucking line, bitch. Mitchfest held the line. When Mitchfest fell, so fell Western civilization." End quote. Once again, very clearly tapping into this concept of the big lie in how acknowledgement of the fact that trans women are women is presented as some gross deception intended to break the spirit of white society, neutralizing any potential resistance, leading to the apparent fall of Western civilization. This is just straight up fascist rhetoric in that it's presenting trans women and their acceptance as a degradation of society, as social decay, aka degeneracy. And Lily Cade's solution? Quote, "Lynch Caitlyn, lynch the sisters Wachowski, lynch Laurel Hubbard, lynch Fallon Fox, Pedos get the wool, Comos get the rope. Where the fuck are the Marines? Where the fuck is the army? Where are the farmers with pitchforks? Where are the cowboys? Where are the Indians? Where the fuck are the men? Where the fuck are the mothers? How can you stand for this? End quote. So, violent ultranationalism, not to mention explicit racism. What makes this particularly ironic is how Cade invokes the fact that her grandfather apparently fought the Nazis in World War II, claiming they would, quote, rip the still-beating hearts from every last one of these paedophile monsters in public, end quote. Then again, this is the serial rapist of cis lesbians who constantly accuses trans women of conspiring to do just that. Mirror propaganda refers to a technique often used in the context of hate speech, where bigots falsely attribute their own motives and/or intentions to a marginalized community. In short, when a fascist is speaking, every accusation is a confession. Yet this is only half the picture, which brings us to the second tenet of gender-critical fascism, the narrative that trans men are vulnerable girls who have, as part of some insidious conspiracy, been misled into believing that they're men as a means to pressure them to undergo chemical and surgical sterilization. This has actually changed somewhat since the days of Janice Raymond, who, in the introductory chapter of the 1994 reprint of The Transsexual Empire, dismissed trans men as being quote-unquote relatively rare. Raymond asserted that part of the reason for this was that trans men were an afterthought to the movement, leading them to become little more than a resource, a quote, token that saves face for the male transsexual empire. She is the buffer zone who can be used to promote the universalist argument that transsexualism is a supposed human problem, not uniquely restricted to men. She is the living proof that some women supposedly want the same thing. However, proof wanes when it is observed that women were not the original, nor are they the present agents of the process. Nor are the stereotypes of masculinity that a female-to-constructed male transsexual incarnates products of a female-directed culture. Rather, women have been assimilated into the transsexual world, as women are assimilated into other male-defined worlds, institutions, and roles, that is, on men's terms, and thus as tokens. End quote. Yet, for as different as said narrative is to the one we see today, we still have hints of what was to come. We still see trans men being stripped of their autonomy, hand-waved as nothing more than simple-minded pawns, exploited by an insidious other. Of course, this entire narrative conflates a lack of awareness on part of cis society with an objective understanding of the world, assuming that the rates of trans men medically transitioning throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s was reflective of the actual prevalence of trans men throughout society. In doing so, Raymond ignores historical social biases, namely how those assigned female at birth have been understudied and underdiscussed at every turn. You know, the very same biases she's attempting to call upon to frame trans men as an afterthought. Just consider how many of the historic laws targeting gay and bisexual people only target those perceived as gay and bisexual men under the category of sodomy, completely ignoring those perceived as gay and bisexual women. This doesn't mean that said women didn't exist or that they were in fact all women, just that they were seen as less transgressive and were subsequently erased from conversation altogether, something that is a double-edged sword. With regards to trans people, we have to acknowledge how someone assigned male at birth, coming out as a woman and wanting to medically transition, is seen as this incredibly radical act, as a man shirking his privilege, his status, and his phallus, which is often treated as if it had mythical qualities. When it comes to people assigned female at birth coming out as men, however, cis society labels that penis envy and asserts that all AFAB folk feel the same way as part of their psychosexual development, since it's seen as the natural order of things. That of course they hate being a girl and therefore want to be a man. Men are amazing and achieve everything. Who the hell wants to be a woman? Well, trans women, which is part of why they're attacked so aggressively. A trans woman abandoning her perceived masculinity and thus superiority in acceptance of her female self is a radical act of self-love, one which the patriarchy cannot handle, let alone tolerate. This narrative would have to change, however, in large part due to the advent of the internet, which gave marginalized communities the ability to self-advocate. Remember that double-edged sword with regard to erasure? Whilst it's generally better to not be criminalized under the law, erasure also means you lack the tools to describe your own existence, making it much more difficult to form a community or advocate for yourself. At the time the transsexual empire was written and then republished, the vast majority of the coverage focused on trans women. This meant that, for all the shit thrown at trans women, we at least had an advantage in that cis society was talking about us, giving us the language we could use to connect and self-advocate. Trans men, meanwhile, were largely denied that, meaning the conversation couldn't even begin. This has historically led a lot of trans men and trans masc folk experiencing gender dysphoria to misconstrue their dislike of being a girl as the result of the patriarchy rather than gender dysphoria. That of course they hate being a girl, society treats girls like absolute shit. The lack of first-hand accounts by trans men prevented other trans men from realizing the nuances that distinguish how they felt from the way cis women feel regarding societal sexism. This changed with the advent of the digital age. No longer were trans people reliant on printed or broadcast media to have their stories heard, and awareness regarding trans existence exploded, culminating in the previously mentioned trans tipping point of 2014. No longer was knowledge the primary barrier to accessing trans healthcare, but social stigma. And since trans women are more stigmatized than trans men, relatively speaking, we would expect to see the number of referrals for trans healthcare reverse, which is exactly what happened. In 2009, 38% of all teenage referrals to gender identity clinics in the UK were AFAB, a number that increased to 71% by 2016. Sadly, far from attempting to understand said shift, members of the gender-critical movement saw an opportunity. They realized that they could now center their attacks upon trans healthcare on the narrative of protecting naive young girls, i.e. trans boys. They began taking to online forums, inventing and spreading various conspiracies as to why this was happening, with many claiming to be parents of young girls who had been indoctrinated into thinking that they're trans boys by some insidious other. These forums were then approached by an American physician by the name of Lisa Littman, who interviewed these supposed parents before publishing their assertions in a 2018 article. Littman used said interviews to claim that minors being referred to gender identity clinics today were different to those of earlier generations in that they demonstrated a sudden onset of gender dysphoria without any prior symptoms. Littman dubbed this hypothesized phenomenon rapid onset of gender dysphoria and suggested that what we were seeing was the result of peer influence brought about via the advent of social media, whom Littman argued young girls were especially vulnerable towards. Said narrative was uncritically parroted by the press and presented as part of a social contagion narrative, literally pathologizing the increased visibility of trans people by comparing our existence to a spreading disease. What the press left out, however, was the fact that Littman's paper had numerous flaws. For a start, Littman never interviewed the trans children themselves, merely anti-trans bigots Littman sought out on forums known for their anti-trans hate. Hell, Littman didn't even verify that the parents she was talking to had any children, let alone trans children. Lippmann also made claims about cross-generational shifts in spite of the fact that she only had a single sample from a single time period. She can't use clinical reports to fill in as an earlier sample, since children taken to clinics are the ones who display the clearest symptoms, making this an example of survivorship bias. That is why the sampling method for both groups needs to be the same. So, how can Lippmann claim that the presentation of gender dysphoria has changed over time when she only has access to a single sample from a single point in time? She can't, at least not honestly, but she does it anyway. And it only gets worse when we acknowledge the fact that what the supposed parents were describing wasn't necessarily a sudden onset of symptoms, but rather children who previously hid their gender, deciding that they could no longer do so, and coming out. That's right, Lippmann, and indeed the entire notion of rapid onset gender dysphoria, pathologized coming out of the closet, a common experience for LGBT+ people, which is as ancient as our community. Suffice to say, the scientific community rose up in arms at Lippmann's rampant dishonesty, leading PLOS ONE, the publisher of the article, to issue an immediate retraction of the paper, along with an apology for poor reviewing on their part. Said article was then rewritten to make it explicitly clear that said study presented no evidence of rapid onset gender dysphoria or an apparent transgender social contagion, merely speculation. The sections edited included the title, abstract, introduction, discussion, and conclusion, so pretty much the entire damn paper, which had maliciously misportrayed the data. Since then, numerous peer-reviewed papers have come out, further debunking Lippmann's pseudoscience, not one of which has had to be retracted for piss-poor methodology. Sadly, the damage was already done, with said narrative being invoked by politicians as if it were a genuine phenomenon, a social disease that was infecting young girls. This solidified the narrative of protecting naive young girls as the gender-critical ideology's new rallying cry. We see a clear example of this in Abigail Shrier's Irreversible Damage, the Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters, a book heavily reliant on Lippmann's discredited paper that frames medical transitioning as self-mutilation to provoke an emotional response in the reader. This is a narrative promoted by the likes of J.K. Rowling, who also invokes ableist stereotypes regarding autistic people to try and bolster her argument in her 2020 letter, asserting that, quote, "Most people probably aren't aware. I certainly wasn't until I started researching this issue properly, that 10 years ago, the majority of people wanting to transition to the opposite sex were male. That ratio has now reversed. The UK has experienced a 4,400% increase in girls being referred for transitioning treatment. Autistic girls are hugely overrepresented in their numbers," end quote, before also going on to reference Lippmann's disgraced study. And this mention of autistic AFAB folk is very popular, since ableism is one of the main ways the patriarchy infantilizes those it perceives as women, which it then uses as justification for the removal of their autonomy. And I include those perceived as women and not merely girls, because it's not just trans boys who are targeted with said accusation, but trans men, as seen when Jill Bearup asserted that, quote, "The women of Mumsnet, at least the ones who frequent the Feminism board, the third largest board by traffic, are furious, because they were autistic girls with dysphoria and are a bit horrified at the idea that you can choose to sterilize yourself at the age of 18 with cross-sex hormones, because they definitely would have," end quote. This is gender-critical ideology, straight up telling us that they believe adult trans men and AFAB trans folk should be stripped of all bodily autonomy, their human rights, for no fucking reason other than their autism, framing the preservation of fertility to be paramount, a fact we will return to in a minute. This is gender-critical ideology treating autistic people as subhuman whilst acting like they're doing so as part of some benevolent desire to protect them. They aren't. This is just straight-up authoritarianism. This is based on the thoroughly ableist assumption that autistic people are simple-minded fools and are thus easily duped. That, due to rigid thinking, we see society's ridiculous gender stereotypes, realize that we don't align with those associated with our birth-assigned gender, and thus conclude we must be the opposite gender. Except, science has shown us the exact opposite, with one paper stating that, quote, "The finding that non-binary identities are most elevated seems to support hypotheses focused on autistic resistance to social conditioning, which are consistent with existing evidence of the same effect with respect to self-description of sexual orientation. Perhaps elevated rates of trans identity in autism might result from a rejection of the binary cisgenderist norm, which, combined with a below-typical concern for social norms, could promote the disclosure of the identity." End quote. To clarify what they meant by elevated, the study found that 94% of autistic trans people in its sample were non-binary, meaning they did not adhere to societal stereotypes of either masculinity or femininity, but rejected them completely. So the idea that autistic people are easily manipulated by social norms and peer influencers flies in the face of everything we know, relying entirely on ableist attitudes towards the neurodivergent that present us as subhuman as justification for the removal of our rights, including bodily autonomy. Speaking of bodily autonomy, a lot of the discussion about the apparent damage of gender-affirming care centers on the notion of fertility, as if that's what's most important about a person, particularly those assigned female at birth. For whilst the trans community talks about saving lives by preventing suicide, gender-critical leaders accuse the trans community of sterilizing children, as Keen Minshall asserts here.
Well, what's the alternative? We either stand firm or we let more and more kids get sterilised. We get more and more kids get gaslit at schools. You know, there's no choice. Once you know what's going on, you can't go back to not knowing. You can't unsee the fact that they are gaslighting children and putting women at grave danger. It's just like these kids have no idea what they're supporting. That groomers support trans youth.
Except trans kids are not being sterilised. They're given fully reversible and clinically safe puberty blockers that give them several years to work alongside doctors to reach an informed decision about HRT, by which time they reach the age of full medical consent. That is another reason people like Rowling and Bearup bring up autism, since they want to undermine said bodily autonomy amongst adults as well, just like religious fundamentalists arguing against young women being allowed to choose a hysterectomy. In fact, one of the lawyers representing the adult detransitioner Bell in the Bell v. Tavistock case, which attacked gender-affirming care for children grounded in Gillet competence, a medical standard originally created by feminists to ensure cis girls could access birth control without parental oversight, was Paul Conraith. Conraith is a Christian zealot who has made his career arguing that women can never consent to an abortion. That is who the gender-critical movement have chosen to work alongside, all whilst pretending to be feminist. And we see this narrative being repeated over and over, including by Lily Cade in her gender-critical manifesto, in which she declared that, quote, "This is your great replacement, bitch. These people castrate your kids. They sold them to Big Pharma to be castrated while you cheer them on for living their truth. The fuck? Self-mutilation has never been and will never be a cure for mental illness." End quote. And it's here that we get to the why. Why does the gender-critical movement believe this is being done, and why do they care so much? It's not, as they like to pretend, for the benefit of the individual. It's plain old xenophobia. The Great Replacement is a Nazi conspiracy, just like the Big Lie, only this one argues that a global order of Jewish people is deliberately decreasing white fertility whilst increasing immigration rates to effectively replace white Europeans with other ethnicities, what proponents of said conspiracy view to be part of an effort to destroy white Western civilization. And whilst you might hope that very few people would buy this bullshit, a 2023 poll revealed that as much as 32% of British people believe in said conspiracy to some degree, which goes a long way to explain why the UK is such a hotbed of gender-critical fascism. This conspiracy has been invoked by Nazi terrorists, including the Buffalo shooter who murdered 10 and injured 3, as justification for their actions. For whilst the Buffalo shooter's main target were the ethnic minorities he despises so much, he included a gender-critical misinfographic who is behind the rise in transgenderism on page 44 of his manifesto. The graphic depicts a number of sensationalist headlines and images regarding trans youth referrals on the top, a mention of Magnus Hirschfeld's Institute for Sex Research in the middle, and a number of figures along the bottom. Each figure has a blue star David painted on them, with the insinuation here being that Jewish people are responsible for the apparent rise in trans people. Of particular note is one of the headlines, which reads, quote, 4,000% explosion in kids identifying as transgender, docs perform double mastectomies on healthy teen girls, end quote, echoing the previous quote taken from Rowling's 2020 blog post. It does so whilst putting the focus on said AFAB children's reproductive and sexual capabilities, again, framing this as the real issue. Moving on to page 45, we have an article titled Transgender Camp Founder Talks Jewish Summer, with a photo from one such camp depicting several children practicing archery, captioned with the following, quote, notice that the camp is disproportionately white, and not only that, but the white people are really white, like Scandinavian-style white, end quote. And it's above this photo, alongside an anti-Semitic caricature of a Jewish person, that we get the how behind said Great Replacement, with a further caption role-playing as said Jewish caricature, reading quote, Haha, yes white goyim, non-Jewish person. Give your children to me, and I'll make them think they're girls. Haha. Thus they'll all either kill themselves or become genetic dead ends. Oy vey, goyim. It's just too easy. End quote. Now, whilst the Buffalo shooter focused on trans girls here, this is very much the exception to the rule, which is that the focus is on trans boys and men. So terrorists like the Buffalo shooter see trans people as a way for a global order of Jewish people to decrease white fertility. And to make that argument, they single out Jewish people as the cause of transgender youth, with specific attention being paid to said youth's reproductive capabilities. It's here that we see the way trans boys are perceived under gender-critical fascism, not as boys but rather girls, and that to them entails both sexual and reproductive stock, cattle to be controlled. That's why gender-critical token Alison Bailey, a close friend of Rowling, once described trans men having double mastectomies in the following terms.
Up and down the country and around the world, girls are removing breasts that have never known a lover's caress.
That's why former members of the gender-critical movement have come out and exposed the fact that many of its leaders target lonely people, telling them that if they join the gender-critical movement, they'll be sure to set them up with a partner. This is an offer mirrored in other forms of fascism, in how every soldier will receive a traditional wife. Though the connections don't end there. When gender-critical writer Helen Joyce published her book Trans, When Ideology Meets Reality, she lists names whom she believes are part of a quote-unquote global agenda, responsible for the indoctrination of young girls, namely George Soros, John Stryker, and Jennifer Pritzker, all three of whom are Jewish. This is because the supporters of the rapid onset gender dysphoria myth believe that it is a Jewish shadow state that is pushing transitioning onto young white girls, getting money in the process before using that money to further their control. It is modern day blood libel. And it needs to be pointed out that Helen Joyce is a close and personal friend of gender-critical leader J.K. Rowling, with Rowling not only posing for photographs with the anti-Semitic author, but going so far as to label her as Rowling's quote-unquote battle buddy. That's how supportive of Joyce's work Rowling is. Yet she's not alone. Helen Joyce was famously accused of plagiarism by Jennifer Bilek, with Bilek claiming Joyce has stolen from her 2018 Federalist piece, "Who are the rich white men institutionalizing transgender ideology?" Except there's just one problem. Bilek wasn't the first to accuse a Jewish cabal of being behind the apparent rise in transgenderism. No, one of the earlier sources of said blatant anti-Semitism, excluding the Nazis of Nazi Germany, of course, was a popular gender-critical fascist by the name of Magdalene Burns. Burns was someone known for a particularly abusive form of racist transmisia, who also took pleasure in promoting the conspiracy that the trans community was funded by Jewish billionaires. This is the same Magdalene Burns that J.K. Rowling sang praises of in her 2020 letter, years after Burns had died and her anti-Semitism had been laid bare, with Rowling asserting that, quote, "Months later I compounded my accidental like crime by following Magdalene Burns on Twitter. Magdalene was an immensely brave young feminist and lesbian who was dying of an aggressive brain tumor. I followed her because I wanted to contact her directly, which I succeeded in doing. However, as Magdalene was a great believer in the importance of biological sex and didn't believe lesbians should be called bigots for not dating trans women with penises, dots were joined in the heads of Twitter trans activists and the level of social media abuse increased." End quote. Glorifying said flagrant anti-Semite to her 14 million followers. Though Rowling's not alone, with Magdalene Burns having been adopted as an idol by the gender-critical movement, someone you'll frequently see in gender-critical banners and art. Notable examples of said idolization are the LGBT Alliance's co-founder, Bev Jackson, gender-critical writer Julie Bindel, and the entire For Women Scotland team, all of whom look up to Burns' horrific anti-Semitism as something to aspire towards. And they know what they're doing, as can be heard in this Kim Hill interview with Keane Minchell, discussing the facts that open Sikh-hiling Nazis turned up to support Keane Minchell's hate rally in Melbourne, Australia, and were even caught taking selfies with her scheduled speakers.
When you were asked about the motive of the trans lobby, you said at the extreme end, it's very dangerous people who want access to children and an entire dismantling of society. Do you think that that is not catastrophizing?
Do you not know about the billionaires who, the billionaire men who are pushing this ideology and funding it? Are you not aware of those people?
No, tell me more.
Are you saying that that doesn't happen?
No, tell me more.
You just need to... No, women across New Zealand, they are very, very aware that there are men in women's spaces, men in women's sports, and they are giving carte blanche access to, unfettered access to women's spaces as soon as you say that those men are part of the transgender ideology. As soon as a man basically puts on a dress, he is given unfettered access to women's spaces, including prisons, including rape crisis centres. And I just think it's absolutely preposterous if you don't think women across New Zealand are afraid of that.
Could you please tell me a little more about the billionaires funding the transgender lobby?
Well, yes, you've got Big Pharma, for example. They make a substantial amount of money out of transgenderism. I want to know why it's not important to a journalist to address the fact that there are men in women's spaces.
It's really important as a journalist for me to know more about the billionaires funding the transgender lobby. And since you raised it, I'm interested to know further details. What can you tell me?
Well, I would like to know why, as a journalist, you are prepared to be distracted by that, as opposed to...
But you mentioned it.
Notice how Key Minchell throws the conspiracy out there, but the moment she's asked to name names, she realizes that she's fucked up. That if she starts listing Jewish people in the context of Sieg-heiling Nazis attending her hate rallies, Kim Hill is going to point out exactly what she's doing. That's why Key Minchell is so quick to try and flip the narrative, acting as if Kim Hill is the one who brought the topic up, when no, it was her. If Key Minchell didn't realize she was being anti-Semitic, she just named names. The fact that she doesn't demonstrates that she's fully aware of what she's doing. Yet, far from distancing themselves from Key Minchell, the gender-critical movement began circling the wagons. Hell, J.K. Rowling even offered to pay Key Minchell's legal fees so that she could sue the papers into silence regarding said Nazi attendance, an offer she never took Rowling up on. A likely reason for why is the discovery process involved in such court cases, especially in light of the fact that members of said flag-waving Nazis have gone on video claiming to have been invited by Key Minchell's group. This means that all communications would come under scrutiny, potentially making public any such invite, damning Key Minchell once and for all. We actually saw a very similar incident conclude around that time. In 2019, another gender-critical member, Nina Power, sued Jewish reporter Luke Turner over 16 tweets in which Turner called out her anti-Semitic behavior, labeling Power a neo-Nazi. Power famously lost her case in 2023, the same time this was happening, with a judge ruling that there was substantial evidence of Turner's claims, and Power went on to declare bankruptcy in 2024. So that's really not as unlikely a reason as you might first think. Point is, when I say that the gender-critical movement is fascist, I am not being hyperbolic. They are Nazis in the strictest sense of the word. There is no meaningful difference between what gender-critical fascists claim regarding rapid onset gender dysphoria and what Der Stürmer published about Magnus Hirschfeld in Nazi Germany. There is no meaningful difference between their claims regarding the Big Lie and those promoted by Hitler in Mein Kampf. Both ideologies argue that Jewish people and other undesirables are infecting society with a sexual degeneracy, breaking apart the family unit to bring about the end of Western civilization, with both ideologies promoting violent ultranationalism as the response. Gender-critical fascism is fascism, and it always has been. Feminism was just a convenient lie, a way for gender-critical fascists to distract from what they were doing. That is why it is so important to label them for what they are, to deny them the ability to hide. There is nothing feminist about these movements. There never was. They've always attacked bodily autonomy and gender nonconformity, the very principles feminism has historically fought to defend. Gender-critical fascists just had the support of the mainstream press in promoting that lie. Yet, thankfully, the cracks are beginning to emerge. Ever since Key Minchell's Oceania tour in 2023, it has become more difficult for her, J.K. Rowling, and all the other gender-critical fascists who support them to hide their true nature. Yet that doesn't mean we can relax, far from it. We are currently balancing on a precipice. On the one hand, it seems like general society is beginning to wake up to said fascism, yet, on the other hand, it also feels like said fascism is close to securing definitive power, the sort which allowed the original Nazis to enact the Holocaust. This is the endgame, and we are dealing with a cornered tiger, a movement whose historical body count is in the literal millions. We cannot afford to relax. We need to keep pushing, to crack down, to bash the fash however possible. The tolerance paradox is a lie. Community defense is self-defense, and self-defense against fascism is always justified. Fascism will show you and your neighbors no mercy, so don't you dare show it any. Though, what do you think? How do you feel about the two tenets used to define gender-critical fascism? Is there anything you'd add or take away? Do you know of any other examples of fascism within said movement? How do we best educate people about the danger? Did you notice something I missed? If so, be sure to let me know in the comments down below. And if you appreciate what we do here and want to help keep us running, please consider becoming one of our wonderful patrons who make our work possible. You can also make a one-time donation via PayPal or Super Thanks on YouTube. On that note, we'd just like to thank the following people: Matthew Kovac, Hannah Banghart, Goddess a Lighter, Socialite Wayne Six Denials, Flynn, and Higgins the Seagull. And for myself, Adita and Levi, take care now.